So welcome everybody for this Optima seminar. We have the pleasure of having Jan, who is actually a colleague of mine at the Computer and Information Systems. So I think he just recently joined a few months, maybe early this year. So Jan, before joining Melbourne, he was at Purdue in the US, and before that he held a postdoctoral appointment in the MIT. His PhD was completed in the University of New York, the State University of New York in Stony Brook in 2012, if I'm not wrong. And I'm actually looking forward to this topic because it's one of my interests to see how learning happens on machine learning problems. So the topic of his talk is optimization in combinatorial and non-convex ML, some positive and negative results. So I'm just gonna leave Jan to continue with his presentation, and thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation, and thank you everybody for coming here. So yeah, I will talk about all works during several years, some positive, some negative, trying to always look at what's possible and what's not possible in the field. Here is this work has been in conjunction. Part of the work that I will present was some single author papers I have during my PhD, but also work in conjunction with my PhD students back at Purdue, and also some from statistics or some from computer science, as well as with some master students also that were doing thesis there. I really like to work with the students, being them PhD, master, even I even had papers with undergraduate students, all of them in like important conferences in machine learning. So I really enjoy working with them. So yeah, right now I am continuing senior lecturer here at the University of Melbourne, as Mario Andres was saying, at the Computing Information Systems. I'm also the coordinator of the Master of Data Science here at UniMelb on the computer science side. There is also coordinator on the statistics side. What else I can mention? My work has been funded by National Science Foundation. I'm still working out the funding here in Australia. I arrived like 7 months ago, and still have some funding back in the US. And I have worked in these kind of conferences, like as editorial board for the Journal of Machine Learning and senior PC or area sharing the main conferences in machine learning, and PC in many other conferences. If I were to first talk about the really high level about the area where I work on, I prefer to explain it sometimes in terms of the conferences and how many papers I have in those conferences. Like you can see here, I have some in machine learning, and this number is the papers that I have in these. Some of these are things related more to statistics. Most of the things that I do are related to optimization, as I will present today. But then optimization has been changing many areas, being not only machine learning, but also signal processing, statistics, and so. So you can see that's why I have like a broad set of places where I publish. If I were to say in short words what kind of things I do, I usually try to come up with algorithms that might seem unconventional in order to solve really hard problems and then give some sort of guarantee. Like we can go beyond the typical algorithms that we are doing, but then can we come up with something new, some new views of these problems? As I said, I usually work in three areas, some related to learning theory and statistics, because I usually like algorithms that learn with a small amount of data. And I also propose new problems, new methods. Some other things relate to optimization. How can we come up with computationally efficient algorithms, some convergence rates, how easily we can go, how fast we go to the true optima of the problem. But then there are also other things related to information theory, where we start looking at impossibility results, also related to optimization. Identifiability, I'll talk a little bit about in combinatorial problems. I will focus most of the the presentation in the optimization side. So I'm already focusing on a subset of things that I usually work on. But again, like optimization is pretty much in everything that I do. But I'll focus a lot more on there. And I picked some few papers and kind of research topics based on three main fields. Some of them are on non-convex optimization. Some of them are in combinatorial optimization, where the unknowns are discrete. And some of them are in convex optimization. And I'll try to highlight positive and negative results for different cases. All right. So let me start with some sort of motivation. I will try not to get too deep into the math. I'm really happy to answer questions during this presentation or afterwards if you want to give much more details about the problems. I want to like highlight the important general messages that one can get from this work. So let's start with non-convex optimization. Here, I started working in non-convex optimization. I also have some work in deep learning, but there was one that kind of I was really interested on because it came actually from a problem on fairness. So here, for instance, imagine you have, like, as you have, many of you have seen, many machine learning algorithms are somewhat unfair. And then you end up having some privileged set of individuals and some unprivileged population of individuals. Most of the work in fairness, I would say, follows the framework of the practitioner or the scientist prescribing or kind of knowing what is, or maybe thinking that they know, maybe what is the feature or what is the particular attribute that is creating this unfairness in the system. So for instance, some people come and say, well, it might be the gender that makes one group privileged and another one unprivileged. Some of them say, well, it might be the race that creates difference between these two groups, but that's prescribed by a scientist. And then most of the working algorithms assume that we know what this attribute is. When I started working on fairness, I was kind of interested in problems where the scientist doesn't know what creates the unfairness in the system. So what if we try to figure out an algorithm that figures out what is the attribute or attributes that are generating the unfairness in the system? And we propose a method that actually, while it's solving some machine learning problem, it's also figuring out what are these attributes that are creating differences between two populations. I'll give you one example, one more clear example in a few seconds. For instance, we apply this to a student performance data set. It was a data set of grades. I remember it was in mathematics and some other subject from Brazil many years ago. And when we ran this experiment to figure out what features creating differences in grades to define these privileged and unprivileged groups, we found that things that were maybe more obvious, like a number of past class failures, whether someone wants to take higher education after high school, were some features. But then there was one that really surprised us, which was the education level of the mother. And we're talking about several years ago in Brazil. So I guess the idea is maybe that many years ago, mothers were helping the kids to do the homework. So then the education level of the mother actually created some difference between a privileged and unprivileged population in terms of grades. But there is a technical novelty. I wasn't expecting that we would actually end up working on a non-convex optimization problem, which is the reason why I'm bringing this up today. So here the idea is, imagine you have a regression problem. So you want to do the typical linear regression. You have an input X, an output Y that you want to predict. But then you have two groups of people. Some group that we can call the group +1 and another group that we can call the -1. So the +1 is the privileged group, the -1 is the unprivileged group. And the expected value of the response Y is higher in group 1 and lower in group -1. Now, the challenge here is that we know that there are two groups, but nobody tells us which people are in one group and which people are in the other group. So we have to do regression and at the same time figure out how to assign these samples in each of the two groups that we are trying to find out. And this is related to fairness because there is this principle of debiasing in which if you know what creates the unfairness, then you can make the means to be equal, and then and that's the fairness notion, and then everything should be fine by removing that privilege and unprivilege effects. So basically, the problem is a little bit one thing more than regression. You get an input X, you get output Y's for each of the n samples that you have. You want to figure out the vector W, the regression parameter W. So up to there is the typical linear regression problem. But then we have an extra thing, which is for each of the n samples, we want to figure out +1, -1, which sample belongs to which group. So in this Z vector that is n-dimensional, you want to put +1 to the ones that belong to one group, -1 to the ones that belong to the -1 group. And so then we have this sort of black box that will try to do regression and clustering at the same time. Input is X and Y, and the output is W and Z. There are many details that I will skip, as I said before. So at the end of the day, one can use typical continuous relaxation kind of tricks to this problem. And initially I was hoping, because this is what typically happens in optimization, we take a combinatorial problem because of the +1, -1s, we do a continuous relaxation, and voila, most of the times we get a convex optimization problem. And my surprise was that here we did not get a convex optimization problem, even though we use the typical tricks for continuous relaxation. So in a continuous relaxation, instead of thinking about +1s, -1s for a vector Z, we actually try to introduce a matrix Z that is positive definite, and then we make the diagonals of that matrix equal to 1. That is sort of encoding the relaxation. It's not exactly the same as the original problem, but most of the times it actually works. Again, I'm skipping all the technical details. Happy to fill more of these details after the presentation if you want. But again, my surprise was we ended up with this optimization problem where the variables of optimization is the vector W and now a matrix Z, but this problem was not non-convex. And if you are interested in what this, should be an F here instead of G. If you're interested in what this objective function looks like, well, I just put it below. Again, should be F, but that's not the important part of the message. So it's a somehow complicated function there, but the important is that function F is a non-convex objective function, which somehow surprised me. So let me introduce very quickly the concept of invexity. Like some of us might be familiar with the convex functions, the functions that look like a bowl kind of shape. So for convex functions, the property that is fulfilled is sort of this property that if I pick any 2 points and I measure the function in 2 different points, then that has to be greater than or equal than a kind of a tangent plane that I can put below that convex bowl function at some point V, and that kind of a plane tangent can be described by this formula. Now, this problem that I showed you before, actually it is a what we call eta invex function, because instead of this being a linear kind of a function u minus v, it's a more general eta function that gets 2 inputs u and v. So you can think about these invex functions as a generalization of what is a convex function. So an invex function is a non-convex function that is not so bad. So it's kind of follow a similar property than convex functions have, but it's a little bit more general than typical convex functions. So it's kind of the tangent plane is changed by some other more general function eta here that receives these 2 points. So well, this problem we ended up showing that is invex. And the invexity actually brought us many things because invex functions can indeed be solved by gradient descent problems. So the nice thing about invex problems is that invex problems, the optimum can be found again by gradient descent, and invex problems do not have saddle points, which is an issue. If you think like a general non-convex function, you can think about like like an egg container where you go up and down, or a sinusoidal going up and down. So you have several local minima, you have saddle points and many other issues. But invex functions you can think about like a weird shape, but it doesn't have saddle points. So it's a little bit again more general than convex, but it's not so bad as a general non-convex objective function. So again, gradient descent, things like that can work. There are many other problems actually in reinforcement learning, compressed sensing, learning Bayesian networks, etc., that fulfill this invexity kind of property. And we were actually surprised to find that many things fulfill that property. The other two examples that we worked on this is, for instance, the problem of what is called mixed linear regression. This is a classical statistics problem in which you are given several points. Instead of being a single linear model, now you have two vectors that might explain one vector part of the data and another vector part of the data, as you can see in this chart. So you can think about receiving data from two populations, trying to split the samples into the two populations, and then trying to learn different vectors for linear regression in the two populations. Again, because you have to split the samples and at the same time do linear regression, this problem becomes quite complex, combinatorial in nature, but with some relaxations that are invex, one can solve this somehow efficiently. A very related problem to this is the problem of outliers. So what if I give you points that will conform to a linear type of regression, but then there are other points that are very far away. And then during learning, you want to learn a linear vector for linear regression, but then also discard points that will not affect that estimation of the regression parameter. So again, that's also becomes combinatorial because you have to choose the points that are clean and the points that are outliers, and then at the same time trying to learn the linear regression problem. So again, this is also invex. We also had interesting results. So several problems, as I said, reinforcement learning and many others have this kind of structure. One thing that I can say about optimization, I mentioned that yes, gradient descent converges. This is a collaboration with Surovitsra at MIT. So while gradient descent will converge, the time to converge or the number of iterations that you will take until convergence can actually be quite bad. So then one requires then to figure out different algorithms. So we created this algorithm that is called invex gradient descent. So let me give you like really high level intuition of how this algorithm works. So remember that once you have a function that is invex, there is an eta function related to it. Now let me write the typical gradient descent in a slightly different shape. Typical gradient descent will tell you x at iteration t plus 1 is equal to x as iteration t minus something times the gradient, right? So I just took the xt from the right-hand side to the left-hand side for visualization purposes. So a typical gradient descent algorithm will take the x at iteration t plus 1, subtract this xt, and try to equate it to negative step size times the gradient at iteration t. What we will do is, remember when I show you the definition of convexity and invexity, convexity had a u minus v and invexity had an eta of u and v. So I'm just changing the u minus v to an eta of the two parameters, and the eta is related to the invexity of this objective function. And there you go, you have a expression that is very similar to what we do in gradient descent, but now the expression is what we should do for general invex function. So what we did in this paper is analyzed by following these gradient update steps for eta invex functions, how many iterations should you take to be really close to the optima? And you can see below here that the algorithm for some particular examples converged a lot faster for some invex problems. Like gradient descent might take a lot of time, and then it's still doing improvements, but the amount of improvements that it might do at some point are really infinitesimal, and it might take a lot of time to converge, while this other algorithm can do a lot more improvement and converge a lot faster with some guarantees. All right. So those were the positive results in non-convex optimization. So now let me give you some negative results. Some of you might be thinking, well, but invex problems are maybe too simple because they don't have saddle points. So then we started asking this question, right? Like if we have a general non-convex problem with a lot of ups and downs, can I ever have a fast algorithm that will go to the global minima, to the true minima of that objective function? And we took as a motivation several prior work that was given up until that time, which was, for instance, gradient descent um, uh, was shown to converge to minimizers in the case of only strict saddle points. Gradient descent was also shown to take exponential time, like the number of iterations that the algorithm would take would be exponential in the dimension of the problems. Like if you have D variables that you want to optimize, then the exponential in D would be the number of iterations that you will have to take, which is prohibitive if you think about many problems such as deep learning, etc., where the number of parameters is really, really high. But then somebody also proved that the perturbed gradient descent would escape saddle points, but they didn't say up to this point anything about convergence, because one could start thinking, well, gradient descent is one thing, perturbed or stochastic gradient descent is another possibility, but can we ever create another algorithm somehow with maybe other type of techniques? Maybe the algorithm can check some random points and then try to decide where to go next. Maybe the algorithm can test 2 points first, and then for each of these 2 points, test 2 more points. So like creativity for creating algorithms, we can actually be really creative, and not everything has to be sequential, like in gradient descent. So then the question is like this. Can anybody ever create an algorithm such that make queries at different points and then converge to a global minimum, and those number of queries be very few, a lot less than the exponential in the dimension of the problem? And unfortunately, the answer is no. Let me give you just very high level intuition again. So here, what we thought about is put this as a d-dimensional optimization problem. So this is the number of parameters that you have to optimize. And we imagine that we have a noisy oracle. And this oracle, when you give a point, the oracle tells you what's the value of the function and tells you what's the gradient of the function. And possibly some extra noise, because there is a lot of like batch gradient descent and many algorithms like this in practice. So we went to the general case where there is like the gradient plus some extra noise. And now, so the algorithm or any algorithm will have to somehow query T points. These T points can be in sequence. The T points can be like random points, and then decide where to go next, like whatever the strategy is allowed. And then the oracle will give, again, the value of the function and the gradients at these points. And then the algorithm will have to somehow estimate what is the global minimum of the function. In our construction, we try to make it really, really complicated for any algorithm. So we constructed functions where clearly everything is almost flat. Then we hide at different points something that are nearly global optima. And then we put like epsilon away the true global optima from the nearly global optima. So we try to make as hard as possible to any algorithm to really figure out what is the global minima. And that's one of our conclusions, is that, again, any algorithm, if it is allowed to do T queries, it can be in sequence or not. They can use knowledge from prior queries or not. So the algorithm is allowed to do anything they want with those T queries and ask the queries at any point they want. But we show that the number of queries that any algorithm has to ask is in the order of 2 to the power of the dimension. So if you think about dimensions that are in the millions, then the answer is, well, it will take a lot of time to converge to the global minima. This is compared to, for instance, for convex functions. It is already shown very good rates where the number of queries is just linear in the dimension. So T is proportional to D for the convex case. But in the non-convex case, we already show that it is proportional to exponential in D. All right, so then that's a negative result. So this answers the question, can anybody ever have a deep learning algorithm that will that will converge to the global minima? Well, in general, no, or any non-convex optimization that will convert to global minima, in general, no. But if we add more extra conditions, maybe yes, right? So this is in the most general sense that there are non-convex functions that are really, really hard to optimize. Now, let me jump quickly to another case, which is the combinatorial optimization case. So now we switch from continuous kind of optimization to optimization in a more discrete space. And I'm motivating this initially from, like, let's say, exploratory research. Imagine you have different variables and you are interested in the causality between the variables, like whether A causes B, like does drinking lead to a longer life? Then you start collecting data for checking whether there is a causality effect between two variables that you're interested on. But more generally, what you have is a system of variables, right? So here, imagine you have as an input data P different variables. Here, let's say 9 variables, and then you're interested into these 9 variables, what causes what, right? So this one is like a variable 1 is causing effects in variable 4, variable 2 is also causing effects in variable 4, and so on and so forth. But you want to learn that just in an exploratory fashion, just by looking at the data. This is a classical optimization problem that has been around for, I would say, since 1990s. So it's around like more than 30 years or so. The problem is really hard because we require these graphs to not have cycles. Like if you follow the direction of the edges, the direction of the arrows, you shouldn't go back to the same original node where you started from. And that is what makes it really complicated, because there are many of those graphs and you want to enforce this acyclicity type of constraint. So in fact, you have, like, for n nodes or n variables, you have 2 to the n square candidate directed acyclic graphs. And there has been extensive work, many algorithms. There are some algorithms that are exact methods that take exponential time. They don't give you any guarantees. Exponential time and some guarantees. And there has been also heuristic methods that take polynomial time, but there are no guarantees for this method. So we were trying to think about looking at the gap. Can we take polynomial time and still give some guarantees? Is that possible in this regime? And the answer is yes, but with extra details. If you're interested in this, I'm very happy to explain more details. I'll give you one insight today, but there is a lot more to this. So here we go for one particular case in this presentation, but we have many other cases in the literature. So here is a case where I'm assuming that all these causes and effects are linear. The way to think about this is like, this is what is called the structural equation model. So here the idea is that if you think about it like this, variable x1 is not affected by anything. So basically all the variables in the system are kind of a weighted sum of the parents or the nodes that are pointing to that variable plus some independent noise. So here, for instance, x1 doesn't have any parents, so it's just pure noise, the value of that variable when you get a sample. Then for the same sample, the value of the variable 2 will be equal to, again, like a weighted sum of the parents, but here is only one parent. So there is this weight associated to this effect. So it will be B21 times the value of the parent plus some independent noise. And then we follow the same for everybody, right? Then x3 is kind of the same. X2 is the only parent, but there is a weight B32 times the value of the parent plus some independent noise. And the last one is x4, which is the weighted sum between x2 and x3 plus some independent noise. So you can think about this equation as how are samples being generated? Like first the parent gets a value, then the children of the parents get a value, then the children of the children get a value, and then you get all the variables for one sample. And then this process is repeated several times. We can also write that as a matrix, and these weights can be put in a type of adjacency matrix where you have like the B21 here, you have the B32, so 3 is the row and 2 is the column, and so on and so forth. Then we can look at, we want these weights to be different than 0, and everything else is 0 because there is no effect, there is no edge. And if you look at this, the non-zero pattern of this matrix, that's actually the adjacency matrix associated with this directed acyclic graph. And then again, here ends are independent noises, and the sigmas are the variances of those independent noises that I have. So that's kind of one roughly initial simple model that we started with. I'll give you a little more insight why this model was important. But again, there were many generalizations later. There are many problems that are interested here. What I will focus on is one particular issue, identifiability. This identifiability aspect is a principle that statistics has had for a long time, but very few people have thought about it in optimization. So then I'll try to tell how can we use principles from statistics to help optimization? And then the other more natural concept is, can we solve this problem efficiently in computation? There are other questions associated to number of samples and impossibility results that I will not talk about today, but we have asked this question from many different angles. Let me argue something about identifiability, because this is an exploratory method. So if a neuroscientist come to me with, let's say, fMRI data, and I run my algorithm in fMRI data, I would prefer to give a neuroscientist a model with all these edges of how different brain regions affect other brain regions, or how different behavioral measures make an effect in brain regions and the activity of brain regions and so. But I would like to produce models that up to some point are unique in the representation. And I'll show you one example of what is good and what is bad about this in these linear structural equation models. So I will not get into the math, but the just two lines that are important here is that what I show you in the previous equation can be written in this way, like a vector x can be equal to a matrix B that I showed you before, times the vector x plus the independent noises. And one can look at what happens in the covariance matrix in such a process. And here, actually, instead of the covariance matrix, I'm looking at the inverse covariance matrix, which is just is the inverse matrix of the covariance. And this is an equation that actually relates the weights B that I had here. So you can think about this as the matrix B, and the vector of the vector of the noises, which is actually has variance. These noises are independent and they have these variances here. So the long story short is that if I look at the inverse of the covariance matrix of this process, I'll get some equation like this by playing with this equation. And you can notice here, there is the matrix B, there is a transpose there, but here is the variances in some sort of diagonal. So given that, I started thinking in this way. So one thing that we can easily observe from data, especially, let's say, for the sake of argument, the data is Gaussian. One thing that will describe uniquely whatever the data we have at hand is the covariance matrix, right? So given this covariance matrix, let's say, so we have here 3 variables. So that's why we have 3 nodes in each of these examples. We have this covariance matrix where you have 3, 2, and the rest is 1. So then I was asking myself, okay, if I have this covariance matrix, which I can easily observe from the data, what are all the possible matrices B and graphs, as well as noise variances that could lead to exactly the same covariance matrix? And what I'm putting you here for this 3 variable case is 5 examples. Here next to the nodes or next to the variables, what I'm writing is the noise variance sigma. And next to each of these arrows, what I'm writing is the B. So here is the B31, the B32, and so on and so forth. What I want to say in this slide is any of these examples of graphs with all these weights and noise variances lead exactly to the same covariance matrix. So now from interpretation, imagine you are interacting with a neuroscientist, and then you say, well, neuroscientist, I have any of these graphs. And then the neuroscientist will say, well, Is it that this behavioral measure affects the activity of the people, or is it the activity of the people affecting the behavioral measure? There are so many different explanations of causality here. So this is kind of an issue with linear structural equation models and in general with Bayesian networks. And this is what I was arguing for identifiability. I want to say that identifiability is not an assumption. The fact that some models have non-identifiability is an issue with machine learning models. And therefore, that issue pertains also to the optimization of those objective functions. So here again, I have the same models. Which one would a neuroscientist interpret? Each of these models are giving totally different description of the reality, saying that A causes B, the other model is saying B causes A, but it's just a mathematical issue of the model. It's not really that there is an issue with reality, right? So then we said, okay, there is an issue with the model. What if we focus on a subset then of the models that don't have this non-identifiability issue? And this is kind of what we are doing in the next slide. The particular formula is not important, but basically the formula says that if there is some relationship between the B's and the noise variance sigma, then for those models, there is not an identifiability issue. For those type of models that fulfill this kind of condition, there is only one particular graph that will be explaining everything, right? So again, from the interpretability point of view, it's interesting to kind of think about these extra, these conditions, because if you are not in this world, we show that there are infinitely many, like if this condition is not fulfilled, there are infinitely many graphs and weights that will represent exactly the same distribution or exactly the same data, which is not really good. And then we figure out an algorithm. The algorithm actually kind of goes layer by layer. If I go back to the graph that I presented here, the algorithm will try to figure out what is the terminal node, the node that is not pairing of anybody else. Then the next node, after I remove that node, then I can figure out the next node that becomes terminal and doesn't have any children, then the next node, and so on and so forth. And that led to a simple type of algorithm that is polynomial time compared to the algorithms that for this combinatorial problem were exponential time. And we ended up beating many of the other algorithms in different real world data sets as well, which is, I don't have the explanation for why that happened, but it's actually good. I have the explanation for the more theoretical point of view, but at the end of the day, it actually ended up working better for many real world examples. So that's kind of using, again, like a principle from statistics in the optimization realm. And then people, after we published this paper, many people generalized with many other things. With my student, we couldn't figure out how to generalize, but soon people started generalizing this to many non-parametric cases, score-based case, and so on and so forth. And many things that are non-linear and so on and so forth, things that are discrete and so. I'll do two final things in convex optimizations. I don't have much details on this one, but I want to just give the big message. Now we go back to continuous optimization and the most classical convex optimization problems. So here everything looks like a bowl. Many algorithms exist already, and people are using stochastic gradient. So here, when you cannot compute the gradient because of computation, you add some sort of stochasticity. Things that people have used in the past, like batch gradient descent, which instead of computing the gradient with all the samples, I compute the gradient with a subset of samples. That's using deep learning a lot. There is also random coordinate descent. Instead of computing the gradient with respect to all coordinates, I just pick one coordinate uniformly at random and compute the gradient only with respect to that coordinate and zero for everything else. The property that actually is nice here is that the expected value of this stochastic gradient is equal to the value of the true value of the gradient in these cases. But I was interested in another case in which the expected value of gradients are different from the true gradient. So there is a bias in this computation of gradient. This happens in cases such as, for instance, learning undirected Markov random field models where, because the computing the gradient itself is NP hard, we cannot do it. We need to somehow approximate. But there are other problems that fulfills this assumption that you don't get exactly the gradient in expectation. I was interested in convergence rates. How fast can we still converge to the optimal? Here, notice that I receive bias gradients, so and the expected is not equal to the gradient, so maybe the gradients are these bias gradients are pointing me in the right direction, and maybe in some cases I might converge, in some cases I might not converge. That's the challenge here. Here we actually motivated a little bit from Markov chain Monte Carlo importance sampling in the sense that in many of these cases, people do some computational efforts in terms of the number of samples that they are using, let's say in importance sampling. And then the more samples you use, the better your estimation is. There is a reduction in estimation error. So the general property that we use here is that there is a bias property. You are far away from the true gradient. And then in order 1 over s, so the more samples I use, the shorter that difference becomes, but also in variance, like not only in how far you are from the true, but also in variance, how much you're varying. We assume that both of them decrease inversely with respect to the number of samples that you're using this, let's say MCMC importance sampling, or you can think about this as the amount of computation that you're putting in terms of estimating the gradient better and better. And then we actually looked at some algorithms. I think this was kind of a 2012 or so. So we looked at the typical gradient descent algorithms of that time. There were different flavors. The big picture idea here is that each column is what is the convergence rate that you have. So here, t to infinity, that takes a lot of time, so there is no real rate. But here, 1 over square root of t is okay as a respectable rate. Like the more iterations you take, you converge to the true optimum with that gap to the true optimal value. But 1 over t is better. 1 over t squared is, of course, better. It converges faster with 1 over t squared. And here, what I'm putting in the table is for the different algorithms, what is the number of samples? What is this number of samples ST that you should use? So here, for instance, in this algorithm FB, which is a basic forward-backward splitting, you should use log T samples for these gradients, this effort in computing, or how many random samples you use for computing, so that you get some convergence. But if you use T1/2, you will get 1 over the square root of T convergence. If you use T samples, you can get 1 over T convergence. There is no way this algorithm gets 1 over T squared. So one story is that none of these algorithms can get 1 over T squared. And surprisingly, there was one algorithm that was very popular at the time, and I think is still somehow popular, the gradient descent with acceleration in Bayesian networks. In deep learning is used a lot. But remember, this is the convex world, but that's the same algorithm. This algorithm is not guaranteed to converge in any case. So there is not enough computational effort for computing these bias gradients that will lead you to get some convergence rate. So that's, I guess, is still an open problem, but we were not able to get any guarantee in this case. So basically, algorithms that are faster, algorithms that converge faster, have a real problem in this regime where the gradients are biased. If the gradients are unbiased, there is no issue. It's a lot simpler, relatively simpler to make proofs. But as long as the gradients are biased, things become quite complicated. And being faster as an algorithm is not the best. It's better. Algorithms that are slower actually have some chance to get convergence. And then we tested that experimentally, and we actually show that the theory that we have predicts what we observed in practice with many of the algorithms. The last point, the last 2 slides I want to show is also in convex optimization in a field that we also found that people worked a lot in the last years, but then there was some sort of lack of, as a community, lack of enough effort that they were putting. But then we're saying, okay, are they new things that we can do with tensor problems? There is nice, very beautiful algorithms for these high order optimization type of problems. Many of these problems are actually like similar to graph cut type of problems, or given a graph, you want to separate two set or do clustering of the graph into two parts so that the connections between the two are very few and the connections inside this group is really large. But in high order problems, you're interested not only into, you can think about each node as authors. So each edge is like whether the two authors have a paper together. In high order problems, you're interested in the relationship between more than two entities. You can think about, let's say, four authors, whether they had a publication together. So that's what we call the hyper edges. And for this, we actually ended up coming up with some new tensor cone that generalizes the positive semi-definite cone that is used for positive semi-definite programming. And it kind of gives a new view of high order problems. So here, basically, it's very similar to the graph cut. In the graph cut case, what you receive is like a matrix of inputs, and then you're trying to maximize some linear objectives subject to diagonals equal to 1, and subject to Z to be a positive semi-definite matrix. So here we are generalizing that, let's say, to the fourth order tensor. This matrix A is an input and is encoding the relationship between, let's say, four authors, and so you have n authors in the matrix. But here the constraint is different because this is Z is not a matrix now. Z is a tensor. This cone is actually like the cones that can be written as a summation of rank 1 tensors. And this is very similar to what happens in matrices. When you think about positive semi-definite matrices, just remove these two terms. And then you will see this as a summation of rank 1 things of outer products. Here, what we are doing for tensors is just adding more outer products. This is still the sum of rank 1 things, where U's are vectors. And that's what we call the Karatheodori tensor cone. We show that that cone is actually convex. So it generalizes positive semi-definite matrix cone to higher orders. But there are open questions. So I'm collaborating with Yifan Sung at SUNY Stony Brook for the algorithmic part. Like at this point, we don't know. We know that the cone is convex. The optimization problems is convex, but not all convex optimization problems are easy. There are some copositivity and some other well-known problems that are convex, but they are hard. In this case, we don't know whether this is a hard problem and this is an easy problem. I know it generalizes semi-definite programming. I know it is NP hard. If we remove this constraint, we know how to show that it would take exponential time to optimize. So we know it's difficult. But this constraint is actually adding something interesting, and that's my hope. I know already that projected gradient descent is NP hard. Like I know many negative results, but the problem is still open. So I'm really eager to know whether this is a hard or an easy problem. But what I wanted to say is also that this cone is kind of a new set of tensors, and I believe it might be useful for many other problems besides the ones that I was talking, like hypergraph cut, which was kind of the focus of my past research. And that's all I wanted to share today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. That was very interesting.